Were you shocked to learn that the right was perfectly capable of learning the actual definition of the First Amendment this whole time? While, of course, still applying it incorrectly? Are you frustrated that appealing to what appears to be a shared set of morals with the right is actually completely ineffective? Well, guess what? Now there's research supporting that. Yes, that's right. A new study has just come out that shows that appealing to the right's sense of morality doesn't actually work because they know that the left has the moral high ground. They just don't care. This also, by the way, validates, at least in my opinion, the idea that consequences, humor, humiliation are often better tactics to convince the right to change their tune on something than actually just appealing to their sense of being a decent person. Now, just to be clear, and I will dive into the research in just a second, obviously no group is a monolith, and I don't believe that this means that you should stop talking about the moral obligations or morality of different stances. There's a good chance that the reason the right understands that left-leaning principles and ideologies are more moral is because they are talked about. Nor am I saying that those sorts of arguments cannot work on specific individuals. I'm just saying that appealing to the right's sense of morality generally doesn't work on a large scale. And I'll show you what I mean. So this study came out just a few weeks ago from Spain. So a couple notes on the language used in this study. When they talk about left-leaning people and ideas and right-leaning people and ideas, they use the terms leftist and rightist. They don't mean leftist in the way that is meant in American politics. Essentially, they had the participants rank themselves ideologically along a scale. So everyone on the left was one group and everyone on the right was the other. They took a list of ideas or principles that are traditionally viewed as being more left-leaning and more right-leaning, and also asked the participants to basically rank these ideas to see if they also viewed them as being more left-leaning versus right-leaning, and then went on to ask the questions about like morality and whatnot. What they were measuring was a couple of things. Firstly, the quote-unquote moral obligation individuals felt about certain ideas or principles, or moral imperative. In other words, how morally important these individuals felt these ideas were to defend. They basically had statements like humanity has a moral obligation to protect the environment, and had the subjects rank how much they agreed with those statements. So the left-leaning topics that they started with, they did remove a couple, which I'll get to, were environmental protection, gender equality, immigrants' rights, freedom of expression, social justice, and fight against poverty. The right-leaning topics were national security, maintenance of traditions, Christian religion, maintenance of social order, capitalist economic system, individual liberty. The two topics that they ended up removing were social justice and individual liberty because they found that people were kind of like misunderstanding what they meant by that. First, they asked the subjects to rank how morally important or how strong of a moral obligation they felt to defend each of those topics. And you'll see that probably unsurprisingly, the left-leaning participants ranked the left-leaning topics as being more morally imperative to defend. However, the right-leaning participants also ranked the left-leaning topics as being more morally imperative to defend. What this means is that while, yes, left-leaning people's politics reflect their moral priorities, the same is not true for people on the right. That's kind of weird, right? But that's not all they measured. Next, they looked at moral stereotypes, meta-stereotypes, and self-stereotypes. What they called moral stereotypes is how an individual from one group views how moral the members of the other group are on certain topics. So basically, what do you think of them? That the right viewed the left much more positively for left topics than the left viewed the right, unsurprisingly, which are the topics that the right views as being more morally imperative, despite what their politics may suggest. But on right-leaning topics, there was no statistically significant difference between how they saw each other. What they called moral meta-stereotypes is how an individual of one group believes that members of the other group view how moral members of their own group are on certain topics. So basically, what do you think they think of you? On this, the right assumed that they're viewed far more negatively than the left assumed they were on the left-leaning topics. And what they called moral self-stereotype is how an individual views their own group's morality on a certain topic. So, what do you think of yourselves? And on this, despite the fact that the researchers were inspired to conduct this based on the perception that the left is more morally righteous or views themselves as more morally superior than the right does, the two groups basically viewed themselves at almost the exact same level, with the right slightly below the left, but not in a statistically significant way. So in summary, the right views left values as being more moral than right values, views the left as being more moral in terms of those values, correctly assumes that they are seen as immoral on those values, and despite all that, still see themselves as being just as moral on all these topics as the left sees themselves, in what I genuinely believe has to be some sort of hypocritical delusion. Now, this study obviously couldn't answer the why to all these questions in detail, but the researchers did propose some possible theories based on other research, one of which was the idea that participants may have responded on the basis of aspirational or idealized moral beliefs, rather than actual behavior or internalized values. So basically, the right aspirationally wants to believe that they are a good enough person to prioritize left-leaning values while being a right-leaning person. What did I say? Hypocritical delusion. Another theory they propose, again based on other research, is that the left prioritizes harm and fairness, whereas the right doesn't really have any sort of priorities in terms of morality. Not that they don't have moral beliefs, they're just kind of like everything's all the same. For example, their belief in traditional values is possibly just as important to them as their belief in not harming people. Basically, it's all the same to them. And which again, I think means that no, you can't appeal to their morality. They still think they're pretty dang moral, or at least it's not quite that simple, because they still tell themselves that they are good people despite knowing that they do not prioritize the things that good people prioritize. Fundamentally, I believe that the priority is not morality, it's selfishness. And they're not relying on self-reflection, but rather ego. The consequences that they care about aren't things that happen to other people. It's not whether or not it's right or wrong or harmful or not. It's about what happens to them. And their image isn't so much about how they believe that they're seen by others exactly, but it's about what they're able to convince themselves about themselves. Which is why being morally outraged by them doesn't exactly work to make them question themselves, but laughing at them often does. In conclusion, yes, I believe I have just given you scientific evidence to support why FAFO might actually work. But more importantly, if you're on the left, stop holding yourself to moral standards that they keep setting. Not only do they have no intention of ever reaching them themselves, they know that.